Welcome to the week 1 update of my connected pool monitor project. So here's the summary of what I worked on this past week. So I did some background testing on the Arduino with the Wi-Fi. I have an example code up on there of using a Wi-Fi shield. So right now I'm planning on using Wi-Fi to send data back and forth from the pool monitor to a mobile phone app or some sort of web server. I also had some older code that I did previously where I hooked up an analog temperature sensor to the Arduino and showed it on an LCD screen. So I got that code up there too. So far the Arduino code's going pretty good. I have the examples working that I want to. Now, what I also did this week is quite a bit of research on the different sensors and components and probes that I want to go into the system. So I looked at different types of environmental sensors, I'm going to call them, like air temperature, light exposure, and also some water temperature sensors. And I have a write-up on that as well. And also I started to look at the probes. Now, I'm going to need to measure a couple of different water chemicals inside the pool, right? And one of the most important is going to be pH, and there's a probe available that you can use to do that. And there's also ORP, and I'm going to talk later on about ORP probes and how that can be used to measure the chlorine or actually estimate the chemicals level in your pool of whether there's enough chlorine or not. And so I have a link to a couple of things, and I purchased them. So I got a pH probe and I also got an ORP probe, because I'm going to start with those two and see how far I can get with those. Now these probes give out an analog signal, which I believe is a small current value. So you need to have sort of a conversion board and some electronic circuits, mostly some op-amp sensing circuits, to convert that to voltage that, for example, your Arduino can read. So I also purchased one of those converter boards for now. And we'll see how well it works and what I need, and maybe later on I'll end up making my own. Probably, when you go from a prototype to production level, you want to bring as much in-house and consolidate, and in terms of cost, if it makes sense of cost or not, we can talk about that later on. But for example, these Arduino boards, the development boards, there's a lot of inefficiencies in them. They're rather large. They have some circuitry that you might not need. And you've actually got quite a bit of real estate that you're not using on the PCB. So what you can do is you can kind of combine them all into one system sometime later on down the line. So what else did I do? I also looked at some alternative microelectronic boards, and one of the ones I started looking at was the ESP8266 by Espressive. And I also have a 32-bit coming out. Well, it's actually out right now, and people are working on some development boards. And so, I'm starting to make sure that I have what I'll call a second source item available for the main brains of this system in case I run into issues with Arduino and I want to switch over to something else. Now, the Espressive boards are interesting, the chips, because the open source community has made those compatible pretty much one-for-one with the Arduino. So if you start writing code on the Arduino, lots of times you could switch over to the Espressive and vice versa. Now there's some issues in there, and there's some things that work well and don't work well, but that's something that I'm looking at or keeping in mind. And then I also bought a standalone pH meter. It's very inexpensive. It's one of these ones where you just put it in the solution and you take it out. So I'm going to use this as sort of a verification method when I get the pH monitor up and running. So ideally I should get within a small percentage error the same value I get from the probe on the Arduino. So that's a good thing to do when you can, to sort of when you're building up a system, is to test things along the way and verify them against a known value or a known source. So when I start looking at some of my design notes and challenges, and I have this write-up, I'll put it up as a summary on my website. So I'll cover a few things that I've already talked about, but we'll go in a little bit more in depth. So the probes. So these probes are interesting in how they work. I'll talk about that later on, but when you start looking at these probes for this type of system, there's sort of what I'll call the lower cost or cheaper probes that are used, more for lab science kits, and then there's obviously the industrial commercial grade, and those can cost in the thousands of dollars. So I'm trying to start out, obviously on the lower, cheaper end to see how well they work, and then go from there. From what I've read and from what I've seen people talk about, I think the problem really with these probes long term in a product is probably going to be reliability. For example, some of the probes seem really cheap, like $20, $30, but when you start looking at the data sheets or the vendor notes, some of them aren't really designed to be left in the solution long term. They're really made for short-term testing, so you put it So put it in your glass of water, test the pH, you take it out. Now this one that I purchased is supposed to be good to leave in a solution for indefinitely. The shelf life, I think they said for this type of probe is 1 to 2 years, which would be pretty good for a pool monitoring project or an end product. But there's going to be some other issues I'm going to have to take in consideration. For example, the type of pool filter that I have uses sand, so it's not using salt. And salt's a lot more corrosive than sand. And then, while this is designed just to test pH, I don't know how well it'll do with other types of chemicals in there that you might need to adjust your overall pool chemical level. So there'll be some long-term reliability testing that will need to be done with these probes, but really that would probably be done more at the prototype stage of the project. So we get the proof of concept down first, make sure that these probes are going to work, and we can use it to essentially assess the water quality. But that's definitely something that I'm thinking about and an issue I'm going to have to address going forward. And let's see what else. So like I said, for now I'm going to focus on using the Arduino board with the probes really to measure the pH and the ORP value. I have to do some more research on really how to figure out the best equation, or really the best algorithm overall, I'll call it, that I'm going to use to address when pool chemicals are needed to be added to the pool, based on the pH and the water temp and the ORP value. How's that all going to go together to figure out, okay, the water quality or the chemical level isn't where I want to. So I think that'll be an interesting part as I continue my research and kind of see what I could come up with. And then, for the first pass metric, what I'll do is I can test my pool water and compare it to some of these pH strips, inexpensive ones that you can get that'll show you like exactly what your free coralline level is and how much other chemical levels are in there. So I think if I can gauge it with that at first, that would be a good test to see that at least the system has to be as good as using a manual pH strip, which is kind of what I'm trying to replace in the first place, right, with this pool monitor. I talked about using the Espressif chip. So one thing I noticed with that is the 8266 is it only has one analog input, which could be a problem because with this Arduino setup I have and the probes, I've got 2 probes. Those are going to have an analog input each. I believe the water temperature sensor is going to be digital, so that would be fine. Yeah, so I might just not have enough with the 8266, but again, the ESP32, the 32 bits, I think got 40 GPIO pins, but that's not as mature yet. So anyways, that's something I could look at in the background as I go forward. The last thing for design stuff I was looking at was sort of the display screen. Right now I'm using this LCD display. It's from commonly used in the old Nokia phones, so it's I can't remember, something like 84 by 64 characters. So it's more of a black and white style LCD screen. It's not e-ink, so it'll work at first, but I'm not sure for a final product if that's exactly what I want to go with, if that's going to have enough polish or enough design aesthetics. So I need to start looking at some other screen options. I know in the past, using different development boards, the Microchip PIC or ST Micro, I've been able to find some nice 3 to 5 inch color screens that you can do a lot of nice graphics if you want to display graphs especially. So I need to do some more research with Arduino. I didn't find anything yet this week right off the bat in terms of having a nice and easy color screen. So when I go down and I start looking at business notes and some of my current challenges, as you can see, I'm trying to do this summary each week. It's sort of a couple of main level categories and not just talk just about technical stuff, but also overall product design. So let's see, I talked about the probe, so that's something I'm going to have to look at from a cost point of view. At the end of the day, in order to support, say, both sand and salt pools, if I need more of industrial level probes, that'll increase the cost quite a bit. So that's something I need to think about from a business perspective. The other thing is I need to do some research on, for example, say in the United States, what's the breakdown of sand versus salt pool filtering systems, because that would be really interesting to know. Which I really have no idea about. I haven't looked into it yet. I'm just used to what I have, which is sand. But I see quite a few salt filter systems out there. So maybe salt's even more popular. So that's something I need to look at and consider. And then I talked about the LCD screen and the display, and it just from a design point of view and a business point of view, obviously adding a screen is going to add cost, and I'm still going back and forth on whether do I really need to have a screen, or in the final product, can it just go to an app or a web server? So again, I think for the proof of concept, I'm going to have a screen because I want to have local feedback, especially for debugging and easy testing. And then I'll see how things progress. If I get a good solution going for the internet connectivity and I really feel like the screen's not adding much value, then I can drop it off. But for now, I'm going to leave it in, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so what are my plans for next week? So, I ordered the pH probe and the ORP probe, and I've got a conversion board. So really I want to get that up and running with the Arduino. I can just put out different glasses of water. I bought some pH buffer solutions at different levels. So I can do a lot of what I'll call tabletop testing. I don't need to go put it in the pool yet. So, I can really try out the system and do some measurements and get the code base set up and working, and make sure that that's going to work for what I needed to do. And then, in addition to that, I also need to do some more research on the pH and the ORP values and sort of how that's used, to assess the quality level of the water in a pool, and kind of figure out, what I'm going to use for an algorithm, or what I'm going to use for threshold levels to decide that, more chemicals need to be added to the pool. So I need to look into that more depth and, come up with a game plan on how I'm going to tackle that. And then another thing is I do need to start thinking about the packaging. Not necessarily, I think, for the proof of concept. I've got various waterproof containers and things that I can hack together and drop in the pool for a day, a week. But, essentially for the first prototype, I really need to think about, what I'm going to use, how it's going to attach to the side of the pool, and how I want the probes to sit in the water, and the electronics. Do I want it to be on the water level side of the pool or on the outside, which would probably be easier, not to worry about water getting into it. So I need to start thinking about the packaging, and maybe sketch out some designs and see where that happens. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so that was my update for the first week. I got my plans for the next week. I think things are going pretty good, and hopefully you guys are enjoying this, and I'll give you the update next week.